Universe. I'm Jessica Sandoval, and I lead the Unlock the Box campaign. Good afternoon, and welcome to Unlock the Box Presents More Than the Police, Criminal Justice Reform from the View of Survivors. We're a national campaign focused on ending solitary confinement in U.S. jails and prisons over the next 10 years. Unlock the Box was formed in response to an overwhelming body of evidence showing that isolation and sensory deprivation of solitary confinement conditions in which approximately 60 to 80,000 Americans are currently being held have disastrous impacts on the mental and physical health of incarcerated people, on their families, and the communities in which they will return. We are witnessing a humanitarian crisis unfolding with the advent of COVID-19 and the failure on the part of correctional officials to develop comprehensive plans for containing the spread of the virus inside facilities, and instead chosen to systematically enforce a practice that the United Nations refers to as torture. COVID-19 has led to an explosion in the use of solitary confinement. We now estimate over 300,000 people are being held in isolation, a 500% increase since April, as compared to the estimated 60 to 80,000 people held in solitary confinement prior to the outbreak. Today, we are going to be featuring two of my favorite people, both who are fathers, artists, activists, and novice instrument players. They also have the distinct experience of surviving solitary confinement. I have the distinct pleasure of being able to work with Johnny to end the practice of solitary confinement, but he's also the best dressed person I know. Johnny has the gift of gab. He is often asked to speak to varied audiences on topics including the perpetual consequences of justice involvement, access to higher education, and solitary confinement. Johnny works as the director of the U.S. prison programs for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, an interfaith organization working to end U.S.-sponsored torture and cruel and human degrading treatment. He is also a steering committee member of the Unlock the Box campaign and recently started his own business, Day One Pictures, to pursue his other passions. Dwayne and I go back to the early 2000s before he had a handful of books written and an NAACP Image Award. I've heard him speak numerous times, each one more and more introspective. When he speaks intimately about the details about his trek from incarceration to Yale Law School and the role that grit, perseverance, and literature played in his success. In addition, he has given lectures on topics ranging from mass incarceration to contemporary poetry and the intersection of literature and advocacy. Between his work in public defense, his years of advocacy uniquely position him to speak to the failures of the current criminal justice system and present encouraging ideas for change. I look forward to this provocative conversation today as we explore ideas for change. Johnny, I'm turning it over to you.
Generous introduction. I really appreciate it. Really honored to be here, and also to welcome Dwayne Betts to the conversation and to be in conversation with him about this issue. So Dwayne, we're gonna jump right into it. Getting ready for this conversation, I went on your Twitter feed and I noticed a lot of things. I know you probably wasn't prepared for the Twitter conversation, but as a person who's been impacted by the system, right? We share that experience, and I noticed that you actually don't like to be called formally incarcerated. And I tell you, I've been home only for 6 years. I kind of subscribe to the term, So just, I feel like we can start there, and then maybe we'll go right into the conversation. We're really curious about some of your thinking around that. And if you can tease that out a little bit more, that'll be awesome.
Yeah, I think for me, part of it is that you could be on a distinguished stage with somebody, and no matter how much you accomplish, the person who introduces you will say, the formerly incarcerated Reginald Dwayne Betts. And it is not an honorific. I carjacked somebody. I don't hide from the fact that I've been incarcerated. I don't deny the fact that I've been incarcerated, but I try to take seriously the fact that my incarceration is not just a matter of a failure of justice. My incarceration is also a matter of the fact that I pulled out a pistol and put it to somebody's head. And so I think that I worked really hard to distance myself from that moment. But if the only way that I'm described is as a formerly incarcerated individual, how much have I distanced myself from that moment? I'm also a father. I'm also a husband. I'm a writer. I went to Yale Law School. I just don't feel the need to always, and plus, that's just a euphemism. What does it even mean? All it means really is that the person who you say that to is now wondering what I got locked up for. I'd rather you call me a felon or a convict so we could get down and dirty about the way in which that language is used to stigmatize me and is used not to allow me to move past that moment.
I really appreciate that. I think that sometimes I've experienced the same thing where I'm like, wait a minute, formerly incarcerated is not a qualification. It is more, it's like nothing you go to school for, and then of course you're home and then you get regulated to just that, and thinking, like, to your point, like, we're beyond that. And this is kind of like the string of dehumanizing in effect, right? Since we've been exposed to policies that really dehumanize us in really unmeasurable ways, and then now we're trying to really redefine what life looks like for us, etc. Is somehow we still get pulled back, and it just really resonated with me, and even made me rethink the entire term as it relates to being fully incarcerated and all of these titles. Another thing that we have in common is that we both visit prisons, a lot, despite the fact that we've been impacted by the system. And of course we're having this conversation during, of course, three different political climates, right? The COVID-19 pandemic, right? We have this very inspiring rise in I want to call civil unrest or uprising, if you will, where Black folks are literally just tired, right? I don't think that we're being saying anything new. We're just kind of saying it a little bit louder and more forcefully. And then now, of course, the year is coming and the Democratic Convention is coming. So we start with COVID-19, right? Like when you're visiting and coming in contact with people who are currently incarcerated, what are you hearing about the current conditions that they're in, and then how things are evolving just during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's I remember when COVID first started, I was attempting to write a piece for the New York Times about correctional officers during the time of the coronavirus. Now, this is before the shutdown. This is when I think we might have realistically expected it to end in a brief period of time, depending on how informed we were. This is right at the beginning of prisons and jails trying to institute some policies to protect people. And what hit me was that we have done a powerful and amazing job at making incarceration a public health issue for a small subset of people. And we have done a powerful and amazing job of making the term mass incarceration enter into the rhetoric of many, many others. But we haven't done as good a job of thinking about it as an actual crisis that touches more than parties and groups that we imagine being able to align ideologically. So I interviewed multiple correctional officers, right? And ended up writing two pieces from their voices that were extremely compelling. One was hilarious. One was just like, and it was by somebody who just worked on the ground, right? So it wasn't somebody with 15 degrees. And I don't even say that to insult the administration of corrections. I got 15 degrees. But what it means is that I've thought way too long about how to fashion a statement and a narrative so that it only produces the results I intend, not any surprise. And that piece from this person has so much surprise in it and so much like soul, right? Had to block it because the system found out about it and jobs got threatened. Had another piece written by a thoughtful cat that was in administration, and he was breaking it down and really talking about how it had changed the way that they interacted at work and changed their emotional landscape, right? Had to break that piece down, couldn't publish it because the leadership on his front didn't want it out into the world. And now people are dying. And I'm asking myself, what might have changed had those voices made it out into the world? We're talking about correctional officers admitting that it's not enough being done. We're talking about, I'm just afraid when everything's going to hit the fan and somebody does get sick. And we were having public conversations that wasn't matching what was being felt on the ground. My homeboy had 3 COVID tests while he was in prison. Got put in a unit. He was in a unit in Virginia where at least about 10-15% of the prison population had, got diagnosed as positive for COVID. My other homeboy got chickenpox at 40 during the middle of the COVID epidemic. And so for me, what I learned is 2 things. It's easier to allow people to perish invisibly when it's framed as a conversation that doesn't admit that like when I talk to somebody that's a CO, it's because that's my homeboy cousin, right? Same neighborhood, same community, and that's how I could tap him on the shoulder and reach out to him. Like, we forget that narrative. And the other thing I learned is that for all of the talk about mass incarceration, we couldn't release 10% of the prison population during a pandemic. Like here in Connecticut, it's 10,000 people incarcerated. 2,000 people have less than 24 months. Another 4,000 people have less than 24 months. 2,000 have less than 12 months. We ain't released 200 people. And these are folks home anyway. So the pandemic has taught me that there is a huge gap in how the rhetoric of what we feel about mass incarceration matches what we could actually do. And I don't even mean open the gates for everybody. I mean open the doors for people who are about to come home anyway. And that is like I think a decade from now, 5 years from now, 3 years from now, somebody is going to dig into this and reveal how profound a tragedy it was that pointed not simply to what the DOC was and wasn't willing to do, but really to what we all were willing to allow the DOC not to do.
I'm reacting to a few things you said. One, you spoke to the power of relationships, and when you talk to correctional officers, it's through these relationships that you already had, and I think that, the criminal justice system, if you will, or a criminal punishment system, sometimes I call it, since words are important and powerful, doesn't allow for these type of relationships to build, even discourages relationships between people who are inside of the cell and people who are on the other side of that cell. And I think in my own experience, when I've managed to find meaningfulness, has come from relationships that I built either with correctional officers who might have snuck in McDonald's for me and left it by the garbage can, look the other way, or just other people who are also doing time that society may look at and like frown upon. And I'm like, hey, actually, if you get to know this person's an amazing person, and etc. You also brought up this question around, like, you didn't say it, dangerousness, but it feels like, our leaders are, the pandemic has forced our leaders to re-question what it does it mean to really be dangerous, who is dangerous, why are people there, for how long are they there. And we've seen most of the releases happen on the jail level, but not necessarily the prison level or the state level, where we see, solitary confinement, being used as a containment strategy for COVID-19. So I guess my question that I want to ask you is, what do you say about a system that is using solitary confinement as a containment strategy for COVID-19? And then this is other thread where I was incarcerated during 9/11. I know what that felt like, being locked up in a cell and not knowing what's happening. I was incarcerated during Hurricane Katrina. I had to watch on the news how people were left to drown, et cetera, in Louisiana. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing some of that now, where people are sending out videos saying, wow, like, we're being left to die, and there's makeshift hospitals in the yard, and I was put in solitary, et cetera. So just getting some of your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think it is actually a real challenge to think about. Let's just say it's an opportunity. Who do we invite into this conversation? A couple years ago, some architectural students at Yale, every year they have a final project, and it's usually to sort of create a model of something that they might build. So it might be a baseball stadium, it might be a music hall, and this year was a prison, or a couple years ago. And Susan Burton was a part of the project. And in terms of like giving some insight from the view of somebody who was an expert on incarceration, both from experience and study and doing the work, right? not just because she was formerly incarcerated, but to have somebody like her involved with the project lifted the profile of the project. And then I was involved. And I think about this, what COVID has revealed is that we have systems and structures that aren't, one, fit to deal with this kind of tragedy, but two, even in responding to this tragedy, I don't think people like that were brought in to think about how do you manage space. So, my homeboy was put in a hole because he had this COVID test and they didn't have any more space in solitary confinement. He actually had it sweet. He wasn't put in a hole. He was put in a like school classroom and was like, here's a cot for you to sleep on, him and somebody else. So he had it a little sweeter because at least he had access to the books and stuff. But the point was that they just didn't understand what they should do in response to this. And people, so therefore, people in the yard, they like, I'm not going to reveal any symptoms. I'm not trying to go to the hole. And what hit me is when he hit me up and was like, yo, man, I'm about to snap in this joint. I realized that dealing with the hole at 20 is a different thing than dealing with it at 40. You know what I mean? At 20, I wasn't even intelligent enough to understand the hardship I was dealing with. At 40, you just kind of tired of it all, right? And so I think that it's a real challenge, it's a real problem. And then just say it's a problem isn't really enough. And that's why I brought up the whole point about architects and people who can help a system imagine using space differently. I'm with dramatically reducing the prison population. Let's say you don't do, this was on Twitter too. Glenn Martin was saying, look, people shouldn't be locked up for more than 10 years. I'm going to go ahead and say 20. I feel like if you say 20, that still revolutionizes the concept of what's possible and what shouldn't be permissible in our system. Because if 20 is the max, there's no way in the world I get 9. If 20 is the max, there's no way in the world, like most of the people I know are still in prison, since most of these guys already did 25, right? So I think that would extremely revolutionize it. But the point is, we need to reconceptualize how we imagine punishment, and saying the criminal punishment system, I think, is a rhetorically valid thing, because then we can say, well, what punishment is okay? You got 2 bodies, what's okay? You got a body, what's okay? You got 4 robberies, what's okay? But then the other part of it is, once we begin to have that question, we can start thinking about how to think about these spaces operating in a completely different way in the interim, because in the interim is when folks will die. Folks will die from COVID in the interim. Folks will die from overcrowding in the interim. And so I do think it's a really valid point.
So I want to, before I go to the next question, I want to react to what you said, and I don't know. I personally just want to get away from punishment altogether, Dwayne. Be honest with you, man. I'm in a place where I think that we can hold each other accountable and hold folks accountable. I tell you, in my own experience, when I was in prison, I was arrested for robbery in the first degree, and I did a restorative justice program about 5-6 years into a 15-year sentence, and I don't want to attribute everything to the program, but there was a sense of accountability that once I truly felt accountable for what happened, rather than I was being punished for it, I think that change was a little bit more lasting. And I think about my friends who did, same like yourself, who folks who we know who did 20, 25, 30 years, and it feels like some of the changes came long before they even arrived at 20 years. My friend Lugo used to say, if you can't go home until you're ready to stay, and what that meant for him was that, yeah, he's like, you can't go home until you're ready to stay, meaning that you don't have to wait to go home to change your life, and you can start making positive changes now, etc. And unfortunately, he may never come home. He's still there. But he talked to me about accountability and how the accountability piece actually lasts longer than when folks feel punished. I would venture out and say, hey, can't we just come up with an entire system, new system, not even a system at all, we can rename it, but one that holds folks accountable versus like the punishment, that fine line between accountability and punishment. I don't know. What's your thinking?
I'm down, but I think that we have to theorize what that means. Because I'm not sure if I know what that means when somebody says something like that. So because I don't know what that actually means, it's like I have a hard time of saying what that should be actually in the world. You know, part of me believes that that's true, but I got to tell you, like I've talked to people who have been carjacked, and one of the things that they've told me is like how profoundly that experience hit them and how angry they were, and some people just want punishment, right? And sometimes accountability is punishment. The thing is, if like I get drunk and I murder your child, then I imagine accountability means that I need to be your child, period. So that, you know, if your child was responsible for if I get drunk and I murder a young kid's father, for me accountability means that like I need to be that kid's father. And it should be actually more onerous than doing a 6-year bid for reckless driving. And so part of me feels like, yeah, I hear you, but it demands that we have a far more robust conversation about what accountability actually means. And the truth is that for a lot of folks, punishment is going to be easier. And the truth is that for a lot of folks, they're not going to want to do what it takes to actually truly be held accountable for what they've done. And so I just think it's somewhere where we got to acknowledge that you were ready to be held accountable, and your homeboy was ready to be held accountable. But some people will opt for punishment. If truly what accountability was revealed to some folks, it's like, nah, I'm good. You know what? I could do 3 years. I broke into your car. I stole 20 grand worth of stuff. Accountability requires me to give you 4 years of my life as payment, and I'm good. I'd rather do 4 years on a yard, you know. So I hear that, but I wish that we were also having a real conversation about what that means, because I don't know if we are. You know, I've been representing people on parole, and you go into that parole board and you talk to somebody's family. I'm scared to call somebody's folks right now because they people got murdered. I don't know what to say to them. You know, what do I say when I want my homeboy to come home, but they uncle, nephew, cousin is like dead forever, you know? And so I think that I struggle with it.
I appreciate that, and I think there's a Johnny and Dwayne best part 2 conversation on that, because I agree with you. Honestly, you know, there are times when I don't know what that looks like, you know, and I know what it looked like for me and the impact it had on me, but there are times when I do ask myself those questions, and I also see them as opportunities. You know what, we can actually, you know, shape and reshape and reimagine all of that, and I tell folks all the time, there's times when I sat across folks, you know, across that mess hall, that I'm like, okay, you know, this person needs a little bit more engagement per se, you know. So totally happy to continue that conversation on accountability. You know, I have 2 more questions before we transition and kind of open it up for the audience, and then we have a special treat for the audience. I really want folks to stay on. You know, like the majority of incarcerated people, right? You and I both spend time in solitary confinement, and while doing our time, and you know, the Watchdog group, and also one of our steering committee members at the Unlock the Box campaign, Solitary Watch, has done a ton of work in this area, and has stated that solitary is really literally short of the death penalty. You know, and it's the worst thing that can legally be done to a human being inside of the United States today. And even like recent research even showed that the damage that causes, you know, that people experience is irreversible, lasts as long after they're home. You know, and I think I started to ask you about your experience, but I don't think I want to ask you directly about your experience so much as so that I'm going to ask you, you know, when you think about your experience, what are some takeaways that this current administration and possibly any future administrations can take away as it relates to solitary and how we treat folks inside, and the impact that this leadership can make now in this specific area?
Yeah, I remember that question. I was writing about solitary for the Yale Law Journal, and I was struggling to get this joint right. and struggling so much so that I'm carrying around Oscar Wilde's De Profundis, which talks about his experience being incarcerated, and he spent some time in solitary. And I'm working on the piece everywhere. So I'm in my barber's chair working on the joint as my man cut my hair, right? He's like, what you writing? I'm like, I'm writing this piece about prison. You know, he's like, why are you writing about prison? You go to Yale Law School. His mind is like, why would you ever want to contemplate prison? Bro, you at Yale, you know, get your life together. And I'm like, nah, I'm writing an essay about this time I spent in prison. And part of it is about solitary confinement. And when I was in the hole. And he stopped, cut the trimmers off. And was like, man, I was in the hole. You know, and he told me he did like 3 years. He's like, the hole almost crushed me. And part of what I recognize about that is that I don't think he said that to anybody. And he didn't expect to say it to me. I think the reason why he said it is because it was so disconcerting, juxtaposing the idea that he had of me based on me getting my hair cut with him for basically a year and a half as a Yale law student, to be like, yo, this cat did 9 years and he been in a hole. And so what I would say is, I echo everything you said about the lasting effects of solitary. And what I would say to this administration and to the next administration, we haven't done a good job of actually being accountable for how our systems of punishment hurt people. You know, and maybe if we were more accountable for the damage that we did and that we do, then it will usher in some changes that aren't currently occurring. So I think that's what I would say, is that we need to imagine what it means to have a system that could hold the state accountable for the kind of hardships that people endure when they get sent to solitary confinement.
You think the system has the capacity to hold itself accountable? I mean, I hear correctional officers a lot of times say, hey, you know, don't tell us what to do. We'll make our own changes. And of course, we push for legislative changes because, you know, we can't just trust policy changes in our own, in my experience personally, but also, you know, across the groups that we work with, you know, that is that sentiment. But just asking you, you know, just off the rip, like, you know, do you think that system has the capacity to hold itself accountable?
I mean, but I tend to think that that we are the system, though. You know, I tend to think that the system is really complex, and one of the ways in which we get got is that we imagine that the system is apart from us. So when I go out there and rob somebody, right, I am my community. I ain't like Dwayne just running around wild in the street. And the reason why I could get sent to prison at 16 in 1996, and a lot of times I don't even want to hear the shit people talking, because in 1996, it was regular for juveniles to go to prison with adults. You could get executed for a crime you committed at 16. You could get life without parole. And I remember writing the ACLU in 1998 and them telling me that this wasn't an issue of record. So a lot of times I'm not even trying to hear this pushback that's like we attacking the system. No, we are the system, right? And because some of us see better to what we should be, doesn't mean that we aren't accountable for 1996 and 1997 and 1998 when there was no Unlock the Box campaign. Right. And so my thing is, if we concede that we are the system, then what does that demand of us? And it demands agitation, and it demands pushing for legislative change, and it demands taking seriously that, you know, maybe the leaders within one subsection of this system can't police themselves, can't self-course correct. Maybe they need more training, but I think it fundamentally demands, like for me, it's like I'm a part of my family or I'm not, right? And so I can't act like, you know, my son, like when he messes up as an individual. Nah, when he step out of line as a member of the Betts clan, right? And so we got to address that. And I think that that's really important to think of the system that way. And that's why whoever I vote for, I'm wearing that. You know, I'm not like, I ain't moving. I don't got no Canada to move to. My homeboy locked up in Virginia. You know, and it ain't the system that locked it. One of my friends did 23 years, right, for a crime he didn't commit. It was 3 black folks on that jury that yelled out guilty. And it was a white woman that said, I ain't think he did it. But the black women said that they think he did it, and they live in the neighborhood. The young black girl said, I ain't really think he did it either. But the other folks was like, he did it. So, but we talking about the system locked him up for 23 years. Nah, the system did. And that system included those 12 jurors who voted guilty, even though some of them thought he didn't do it.
That's deep. Yeah. Yeah, and that's, I think about, before I see this next question and we open up for larger questions from our audience members. You know, I discovered education in prison. I took college in prison. I did it because I wanted to make parole. That was the only reason, to keep it all the way real with you, right? And in my life, a constant is that I've done a lot of times what I thought would be the wrong thing for the right thing for the wrong reasons. I've gotten the right results. College just happens to be one of them. And I'm a big fan of education. And there are times when some of my peers say, well, prison saved me per se, but it wasn't prison, it was education that actually happened, and really separating the two. And really, so sometimes I find myself educating even my own peers, my own community about these issues in ways which are probably a little bit more fine-tuned than even, folks who are not part of that community. And now this is large kind of like emotional, this is large conversation around the country around, hey, there's the violence that we see outside, right? We saw George Floyd get murdered right before our eyes, mainly because we have these things here, right? And it's opened up conversations like this to happen. Okay, let's look at violence in prison. Let's look at, all of the atrocities that happen in prison, and how, people are killed almost every day inside of this system, and, really confronting racial injustice more than ever before. When you think about all these things, how do you think that we can build on this current moment, to achieve, our long-term goals? Because it does feel like it's a moment, but it also feels like every other moment has been a moment, but how can we build on this particular moment, all of those intersections I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, for long-term gains?
I think it's a couple ways though, right? I think it is really a moment. And I think that it has to be a really concerted effort to imagine what the next 5 or 10 years looks like. And people doing it on the ground in organizations across the country. I think that what's beautiful about this moment, when we say it's a moment, I mean, listen, the Civil Rights Court didn't exist in 1996. The ACLU wasn't working on this issue in 1996. The Arts for Justice Fund did not exist in 1996. And I'm saying 1996 because I'm kind of arrogant, and that's the year I got locked up. And so it holds a special place in my heart, right? But I'm just saying, all of the things that we have right now, this conversation would not have been possible in 1996. And yet in 1996, you had Mothers Against Mandatory Minimums, right? So, and yet in the 90s, you had people that were sort of pushing to get folks like Kimba out when she was locked up in I guess she was locked up in the feds, but now she's a parole board member in Virginia. And so I think it's important to just note how all of these things build up on what happened in the past, and that we're still trying to find ways to make what we're doing right now build up into the future. And I guess my answer to your question is we have to figure out how to move from not just being agitators, but being the people who are accountable for the policy changes that happen. And we have some of that. We do. Like, I'm sorry, man, Joe Biden, the Democratic ticket, Biden and Senator Harris. So between the two of them, you have a robust footprint in the 90s and in the 2000s around criminal justice issues. We should expect them to match their actions with the rhetoric of change that they've sort of embraced. And they have, if you look at the policy stuff, if you look at the things that they both said, I think that we are in a spot right now where this is much better than, the 90s, when the Attorney General under Bush wrote the case for more incarceration. And you know who that was? Who wrote that?
Who?
It was Barr, who is now the Attorney General under Trump. And so I think and who I would argue now he hasn't course corrected, right? But I think it's interesting to think about, we in a situation to figuratively move away from that time period with our actions, but also literally move away from that time period by getting architects, people who haven't shifted their ideas and their thinking away. So I would say that push the people who are in and have political positions, but also probably keep pushing the whole positions of authority ourselves. Like you're doing, keep doing that so that the issue stays on the forefront.
I appreciate that. All the other straws on the camel's back got us here, and we should definitely continue doing what we're doing in order to get forward. I want to transition to some of the questions in the chat, which are really amazing questions. And I mentioned solitary watch before, so I'll start with solitary watch because it really does lean into what you were saying. If the Democrats win in November, how can we work to ensure that directly impacted people, right? Folks like ourselves and many of the millions of people that are not on this call, are given a role in shaping this criminal justice policy at the federal level, right? Like even Biden, he does have solitary on his platform. I feel like it could be a little bit more robust, but how do we get at this question here? Thank you, Solitary Watch, for that question.
I'm gonna get Alfre because Biden put together an arts committee, and Alfre Woodard is one of the co-chairs of that committee. Now I met Alfre Woodard when I was shooting the show for PBS, and I didn't want to run up on her because she's like a superstar, right? And I'm asking people to introduce me to her because I just wanted to thank her for working on this movie Clemency, and they were like, yeah, and then they were like, look, you could just go say hi, because they were like, we're not about to interrupt her while she's getting ready for this show either. So I go interrupt her and I speak to her, and I was like really moved because I was thinking about how part of this is rhetorically, right? It's like I love Training Day, but how much more powerful would it have been if he had did? How much more powerful would it have been if he had did like a film about the opposite of Training Day, something that was like asymmetrical to the theme of Training Day, and it won an Oscar for that. And I know that Denzel has done all kinds of movies in his career, but the point was that Woodard did this thing in this moment that was about clemency, and I intimately was fighting to get a friend of mine clemency, and so I was moved. Anyway, I sent her a copy of my book, and months later, Biden taps her and some other folks to head this arts committee, and it's 100 artists who's supposed to help shape and form the policy, the arts policy, right? I get a phone call, and I get invited to be a part of the committee, and it was because of her. It wasn't really, it was because she had been empowered to make a decision. So I would say, you say how to do that. I would say you do what she did, and Jessica Sandoval. When President Obama put me on the OJJDB as a practitioner member, right? It wasn't President Obama. It was Jessica and Liz, and they had been working for years to get me in a position of power. And they didn't, they said we got to have somebody represented that was formerly incarcerated, but then they also was like, but this cat is nice. And so I think that people who usually would get that spot have to be like, what does it mean for me to defer and push for you to get that spot? Because it's never going to be the Biden who has this, like Biden is not going to know who I am, right? But Alfre Woodard might have a chance meeting with me, pick up my book, read my book, and say, let me bring you into the room. So I think that's just one step. And then I think the second step is to really take seriously what it means to train people to do that kind of work, to make the messages more readily available to the public, and to actually be good at disseminating that information and sort of keep doing the things that we have been doing. This change is just inconceivably slow. It's sad.
I echo that inhale, exhale. I get that all the time. And there are a lot of things that I know, and a lot of things that I don't know, and a lot of things that, of course, I don't know that I don't know. And when you talk about being able to step back and really, allow other folks to step into that leadership, that really is the essence of the work that I'm trying to do at NEARCAT. Whether building a network of 100 solitary, of folks who experience solitaries, confinement, build their capacity up, whether through training, whether it's through however they identify that they need their capacities to be built in order to really step into leadership roles, and this idea of really stepping back, but also saying, hey, I'm not the best person for this, right? Although I can take it, but hey, you should really get to know Dwayne. You're really, and I wish there was a lot more of that happening. So I really echoing that. It brings me to Mary Beth's question. Mary Beth Anderson, who is retired now, I happen to know. She was my former supervisor first job ever, straight out of prison. Worked reentry mental health services at the Mental Health Project. And Mary Beth says, thank you so much for sharing your ideas. Please provide ideas on how we can persuade people who don't believe our criminal / legal punishment systems are racist than they really are. And I think that goes all over the place, whether it's folks in our own community or folks, who are, who use quotation marks, are part of the system per se, based on this conversation. Thank you, Mary Beth.
Again, I think that's I worked as a public defender for like a little bit over a year, representing clients here in New Haven. And I think what becomes important for me is less to identify the system as racist, right? My clients were overwhelmingly Black. The victims were overwhelmingly Black. The challenges that I was dealing with from day to day weren't like the racism of the system necessarily. It was like this crime had allegedly been committed, and how do we bring some people together to find a resolution to this that doesn't end up being prison? And the reason why I think it's so hard to address mass incarceration, and maybe harder to address mass incarceration to say, Jim Crow, maybe it's harder to address it to some of the other issues. The reason why I think it's harder is because you have so many individual decisions. You have so many individual decisions that implicate people acting like, whether it's an alleged crime or a crime that somebody's pleading guilty to, that it makes it easy for the detractor who doesn't want to shift the system to say that this is not about racism. And so I just don't know how invested I want to be. Like, I would never say racism to the Black women who told me, yeah, I know he's 15, but he pulled that gun out on me and he needs to be locked up forever. And that is a direct quote. I was like, it was a BB gun. She was like, forever, brother. I was like,
she hit you with the brother too on top of that. He's like, oh man. How do I respond? How did you respond actually? I'm curious.
It was long, man. It was like 1,000 conversations. I responded by talking some more. I just shifted it. Like, what do you need? And then I told her the truth. It's like, he's not going to be locked up forever. So the question really is like, what will make you feel better about this situation and feel like you got some ownership? Because the system don't work like that. So the question is, do you want to be a conduit for like a tragedy or conduit for a better outcome? And man, I talked to this lady for hours and hours and hours, man. I felt like by the end of it, like we were friends, I talked to her for far longer than the prosecutor had to talk to her, because, my client was dead to rights and it was clear he was going to plead guilty. And I was able to get a better outcome for this kid because of that. But man, so I don't know what racism has to do with that particular issue. And I don't know what racism, I think on a more global level, it has to do with all of these things that were going on. But when you're talking to individuals, they're going to be thinking about these individual things. And I want strategies to move the needle in those places, to be like, yo, incarceration ain't worth it. That ain't going to work here. And to push people to actually believe that. And I think that has shifted, though. We have pushed people to believe that incarceration is not going to be worth it for so many crimes, So I just got to keep pushing.
Nice. I want to transition. And before I transition, I want to mention that, there's like this big conversation about police violence, and police brutality. And I think some of the narrative some of the messaging that I've used to pivot that conversation is that, like we're talking about police brutality, but police brutality is sort of like an extension of a larger poisonous tree, and that tree, being, I want to say, systemic oppression, and I want to say racism. And I say that also thinking that, like to your point, there's been conversations I've had in spaces where, okay, I can't even, like, racism is not a factor here, it's something different, but really still highlighting the fact that, hey, like the system is inherently racist per se, and trying to find different ways of conveying that to different audiences, which is an art I've found, throughout the years. I want to transition really quickly and actually invite this really talented artist, Rohan Ro, to join us on this in this conversation. Ro, thank you so much for joining us. I want to take a few minutes if you can introduce yourself, and Ro, you're going to share some of your work with us, which is really impactful, and then we can all jump in a conversation together. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for. I'm sorry. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah. So, am I introducing this virtual exhibit that I created for this experience? And it has a lot to do with a lot of the new and emerging voices that are really representing some really powerful causes. Yeah, there we go. We got a nice little version, nice little view of it. So the women in this exhibit and some of the people who are also shown, they represent just different areas of progressive movements. Women's rights as far as like migrant workers. We have an artist here, Matika Wilbur. Her work specifically highlights the Native Americans across the country. She wants to change the narrative of how they're portrayed. And so she actually went around and she filmed for about 10 years every Native American tribe in America. We have paintings of Senator Hakeem Jeffries, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, representative of New York. He has a profound impact because of how he's kind of introducing a different culture to Congress and how they kind of conduct things. When he introduced this conversation about Biggie Smalls into one of the congressional meetings, Nipsey had such a powerful impact because even as a rapper, he always fought to kind of change the narrative and represent something a little bit different, especially in an area like LA where the community is gang ridden, and he wanted to change that by bringing positive things to the community. We have somebody here locally, Ruth Tyson. She actually, what Ruth Tyson did was to write a letter, a resignation from an NGO. And in her letter, she was able to really describe some of the subtle psychological nuances of racism and microaggressions that African Americans deal with in a lot of these organizations. Sometimes it's very hard to even describe it, but she did a really good job. And that letter went viral, and she is a part of now this changing culture of really putting these organizations under a microscope and helping other African Americans be able to have a voice and being able to be understood. There are two other people in the exhibit, Emma Gonzalez and Laverne Cox. Emma Gonzalez is well known. She's a survivor of a school shooting down in Florida, and she became a gun advocate. She became a gun control advocate, and her work for gun control. I think she was passionately inspired to fight for gun control because of how dramatic that experience was for her. She was kind of thrusted into that situation. And then Laverne Cox, she actually is doing a lot for the transgender, the LBQ. I'm going to say the transgender community because she represents transgender women specifically, and she is making strides in that community and representing them well, and really fighting to advocate for kind of an exchange of power so that these people in that community are more protected, because they're kind of targets, by the kind of the ignorance that we have in our own community of transgender people. So you can walk around the exhibit, you can see videos that are attached to each one of these paintings. And the videos, they kind of, so this whole experience for me, I didn't know a lot about these women before I started this, and so these videos are introductory. You click on the video and you actually get a chance to learn a lot about somebody you might have not known as much as you thought about, or somebody that you might have not, someone that you might have seen but not known much about them and what they're working on. So these videos are very introductory, but I tried to make this exhibit, profound, provocative, and really display like some of the sacrifices and some of the triumphs that are that these women have been able to accomplish, with this exhibit.
So, Ro, I have a question, and also, for you, also, Dwayne, jump in, but I'll start with Ro. Is, there's the power of art, right? And what I personally appreciate about the power of art is the way in which it's able to communicate to people that I probably otherwise can't sit across and might not even listen to me. And I picked up photography personally because I feel there were not enough images of, of people with my experience, out there, positive images, and also the first time that I saw a picture of myself wearing a business suit was mind shattering, completely different than wearing a prison uniform. But so Dwayne as a writer, and then, Ro yourself as an artist and a visual artist and artist, how have both of you been able to use specifically the arts, to push your work forward into kind of, and not to say that this is the purpose of your work, but to really kind of put out a different message and narrative and amplify these experiences of people and our own experiences. Like, what is the role of art in a lot of this piece that, these conversations we already had?
First of all, I think that, I'm sorry, Dwayne, and I probably should let you speak first, man, because you've been dropping knowledge, man.
Nah, man, I've been talking shit. Do your thing. I've just been talking.
So, first of all, I think that's a good question. I think that art is culture changing in a way where, you guys were just talking about racism in the criminal justice system, but I think that it starts before there because, me being somebody who has been affected by the criminal justice system, I had a brother who went to prison at the same time I went into the military. And so the both of us, were kind of in this institution where we were being conditioned and broken down and whatnot. What I thought was interesting about that was that everybody's perception of the military and everybody's perception of of prison is so skewed that they don't understand the experience that people have. And so what message the art brings to that is giving people an explanation visually and making it conceivable for them to be able to get a better understanding of how the narrative really is. And especially when it comes to, Black artists, we have a narrative that's always kind of controlled by the media and other people. We have a duty to really write and paint and tell these stories so that people can get a clear view. And also historically, this is the only way that we have a chance to prove what we were doing and how we were doing it so that the message isn't skewed later on and then used against us like it's being done now.
I appreciate it. I see Dwayne step away for a minute. Oh, there you go. There you go. Ness. Go ahead. Right on you, Dwayne.
Yeah, so I was going to hold up this book. I can't really tell. All right, I think you can see this, right? Marking Time. It's a recent book by Nicole R. Fleetwood, and it's about art in the age of mass incarceration. And I wanted to highlight it because, it is a lot of work being done by artists who were incarcerated and by artists who are doing work that's just related to the experience of incarceration. I mean, the piece above me was from my first book cover. Shaheed reads his own poem, and that was an artist that was working with me and then was saying something about time and about freedom because he created that piece for my book. I'll point out a couple of things in a question and comment section. A few folks mentioned like some great organizations. They mentioned Theater War and the Exodus program as projects that look at the arts and the reentry work together. It's important to point out Mural Arts in Philadelphia that does a great job of doing the same thing. And then you got the DA's office actually under Larry Krasner. They hired an artist to be a fellow there, right? And so I think that is important too. A couple other things I would mention is the Civil Rights Corps did the same thing. They've been having artists in residence over the past few years, and that's important because. And then the last thing I'll mention is the Arts for Justice Fund, which might be in Elizabeth Alexander's work over the past really 5 or 6 years, first with the Ford Foundation and now as the president of Mellon, has done a great job of really thinking about how arts should be activated to work on these social justice issues and brought to bear. And this is not a new conversation. I mean, I got books right here. Raymond Patterson, he's writing poetry, and his poetry is talking about civil unrest and police shootings. And it's also talking about, because this published in 1969, and so he has poems about the Birmingham bombings. I got on my bookshelf, and she has poems about the unrest in 1992. And so, artists have always spoken to these issues. The question really, I think, is important to highlight now is, one, the way in which people do the work listen to artists. Because there is a way in which the way that people do the work sometimes feel like their job is to save people. And artists recognize that I'm not necessarily trying to save you with this work.
Right.
The true artist is chasing some type of truth and trying to reveal something that's ineffable about the character of a people, right? And so when you're doing that work, I think it becomes really needed for prosecutors and public defenders to engage with that, for politicians, for voters to engage with that, because then it gives a different complexion of who the person is that we putting behind these cages. And then the last thing is just like me personally, like I'm a poet. I'm not a social justice poet. I'm not, I'm just like a poet. I'm trying to be dope. And that means that, what I bring to bear might not always even be useful for a rhetorical argument that you're making. But I so believe that we incarcerate too many people that I don't think I've ever really, really, really written a piece that says this person should die in prison. It's only one thing that I've written that I can think of off the top of my head that I'm a little bit ashamed of. And it is a true depiction of something that happens. And it's about prison rape. And the thing that I will say that bothers me about that particular poem is that it ain't no redeeming qualities in that poem. And that poem doesn't leave room for anything except vengeance, right? And my question as an artist becomes, how do I engage with the difficult and the challenging issues? And not even to the extreme of like somebody with, not even to the extreme of a homicide or a double homicide or just anything like that. I'm talking about just regular, how do I engage as an artist with domestic violence? How do I engage as an artist with the pervasiveness of sexual assault? And I think that's just like my personal challenge, because if I'm gonna stand in front of you and say abolish prisons, I gotta, as an artist, I gotta be doing some of that work that helps people and helps me think through how and if that should be possible. And the truth is, if my work doesn't reflect that, that means I ain't there yet. And that's why you just can't get me to come up on a stage and say some things that others will say, because I just don't believe it yet. And I'm not going to get up there and say something that I don't believe, because somebody asks, how do you get us to the work of believing, of getting people who don't believe that the system is racist to believe that the system is racist? I don't even care about that, right? We could do that later. How do we get people to believe that the system should change, who don't right now think that the system should change? A lot of times we try to get them to believe that when we don't believe it. And so, like, as an artist, I'm trying to do the work that makes me reconcile those like marginal cases that govern everything that happens in the center. I go to prison for 10 years for carjacking because you go to prison for 40 years for murder.
Yeah, oh man, I know you're about to respond. This conversation, I tell you, I mean, outside of the whole Facebook live thing, this is the kind of conversation I like to just even have, even on my personal time. So this is definitely an invitation to have a part 2, whether public or private, because I too struggle with some of the themes that I have brought up in this conversation. And as a young organizer, only been doing it 6 years formally, and I like to say I was organizing inside. Sometimes it is, local library, general library. I was that guy. He'll beat the ticket to get you to go to keep you from going to solitary. But
put it on the
I did actually. But anyway, in the interest of time, I want to deeply thank both of you brothers for coming on, and thank you to the Raven Group for organizing us. I don't want to close it out. I want to invite Jessica Sandoval actually, to take 30 seconds to a minute to close us out, because I think it's important to hear back from her again. But as a person who is really dedicated to his work, fellow father, but also fellow artist, and I'm gonna send you one of my pieces too, called Collateral, spoken word piece. It's really truly an honor to share virtual space with all of you and folks who chimed in. So again, my name is Johnny Perez. I'm going to step back and create space for Jessica to close us out. Thank you so much, everyone.
Just as I knew it would be, it was a phenomenal conversation. I'm sure our audience was wowed and deliberating kind of what you all, talked about today. And I really want to just thank everyone for participating in this important conversation as we continue to bridge the issue of solitary confinement across the criminal justice spectrum. We're hopeful today that you have a better understanding of how solitary confinement impacts people and the complexity of solitary confinement and the role it has in the American criminal legal system. Our work continues in order to ensure that we build a future without solitary confinement, and we need all of you engaged in that work. We want to ensure that this is the last generation to face this kind of suffering. And I ask everybody here today to memorialize the voices of Dwayne and Johnny and Rohan, to remember that everyone deserves the chance for a healthy life outside of a cell. And we're going to work together to do that. So join us again, unlocktheboxcampaign.org, and we'll see you on the other side.